Hi everybody, it's 314 Reactor here. Today we are going to be looking at Time Spy for 3DMark, which was released in 2016. This is the DirectX 12 benchmark they added in shortly after Windows 10 and DirectX 12 was released. Last week we looked at Steel Nomad, which is the new benchmark that uses DirectX 12, which at some point I believe will be deprecating Time Spy. So it's the perfect time to now look at this. We're also going to be looking at Night Raid, which is a DirectX 12 test for PCs with integrated graphics and has some of the similar motifs and assets of Time Spy, and this was released in 2018. We're also going to be looking at the CPU profile benchmark, which was released in 2021, and of course is designed to benchmark modern processors. So we're going to look through all three of those. We've just seen the demo for Time Spy Extreme and the demo for Night Raid, and we've also seen the maximum threaded test for CPU profile. Let's first dive into the technical documents for Time Spy. So as mentioned, this is DirectX 12, Windows 10. It's got three workloads to it, which we'll look into more detail later. It's the graphics API is DirectX 12 feature level 11. Okay. Yeah, DirectX 11 introduced a paradigm called Direct 3D feature levels. A feature level is a well-defined set of GPU functionality. For instance, the 9.1 feature level implements the functionality in DirectX 9. Okay, so yeah, Time Spy uses the DirectX 12 feature level 11. This gives Time Spy the most significant performance benefits of DirectX 12 API while ensuring wide compatibility with DirectX 11 hardware through DirectX 12 drivers. So it's actually not so much using the DirectX 12 features as it is just the performance level, the non-functional performance benefits, while primarily using DirectX 11 hardware. Okay, so that explains why Steel Nomad will be replacing it, because Steel Nomad will use feature level 12. Yeah, here we go. Steel Nomad, feature level 12 or Vulkan 1.1. So yeah, that explains it then. Anyway, let's go to the system requirements. So yeah, Windows 10, 64-bit, 1.8 GHz dual-core CPU with SSS E3 support. DirectX 12 graphics, although I think that's just your software level graphics card. I think a DirectX 11 compatible card will run it as well. Video memory 4 gigs and storage 2 gigs. We're only going to be running Extreme. Time Spy non-Extreme, I think, just runs at a lower resolution in general and has lower settings on everything. So I think it's just the same test, it just doesn't look as good. So we're going to be focusing on Time Spy Extreme. Let's dive into the graphics test. So we've got graphics test 1, which is of course designed to maximize the use of the GPU while minimizing the use of the CPU. And graphics test 1 focuses more on rendering of transparent elements. It utilizes the A buffer to heavily render transparent geometries and big particles in an order-independent manner. So it draws particle shadows for selected light sources. Ray-matched volumetric illumination is enabled only for the directional light, and all post-processing effects are enabled. So the A buffer is known as an anti-aliased, area averaged, or accumulation buffer. It's a general hidden surface mechanism suited to medium-scale virtual memory computers. It resolves visibility among an arbitrary collection of opaque, transparent, and intersecting objects using an easy-to-compute Fourier window. It increases the effective image resolution many times over the Z buffer with a moderate increase in cost. So it looks like it uses a bit mask and an algorithm to get the area weighted average of all the colors of the pixels visible surfaces, and then it clips further fragments. So I think it's basically just an effective way of rendering many things on the Z buffer in depth to make sure you're getting as much efficiency as possible, which explains why it's being used for this transparency stuff, because I imagine it much more efficiently calculates the transparency. Interesting. Again, links will be in the description to all this. And graphics test 2 is again designed to stress the GPU. It focuses more on ray-matched volume illumination with hundreds of shadowed and unshadowed spotlights. The A buffer is used to render glass sheets in an order-independent manner, and lots of small particles are simulated and drawn into the A buffer. All post-processing effects are enabled. Then we have the CPU test. The Time Spy CPU test does not scale well on processors with 10 or more threads. It simply doesn't have enough workload for it, which is why they came up with the new CPU profiling test in 2021, so it could better handle the sort of CPUs that were being released in 27 onwards, as at that time there were more cores than had ever been in a consumer level CPU before. That was around about the time Ryzen released. So the CPU test features a combination of physics computations and custom simulations. It's 3 times more demanding than the Time Spy CPU test. So the extreme one is 3 times more demanding than the normal one. Adding more simulation requires more visualization, which can make rendering the bottleneck in some cases. This was solved by changing the metric for the test. So it was rendering so much stuff from the CPU, the GPU can actually be affected by it. And instead of calculating the time taken to render an entire frame, the extreme CPU test, we only measure the time taken to complete the simulation work. CPU instruction sets, it uses SSSE3, which is Supplemented Streaming Simmed Extensions 3. It's an instruction set created by Intel and is the 4th iteration of the SSE technology. Okay, so you had SSE 1, 2, and then SSSE E3. So it just adds a whole bunch of extra lower level instructions, larger registers, and a whole load of other low level stuff. So in the extreme CPU test, half the Boids systems can use a more advanced CPU instruction set up to AVX2 if supported by the processor. The remaining half uses the SSSE3 code path. The split makes the test more realistic since games usually have several types of simulation or similar tasks running at once, and would be unlikely to use a single instruction set for all of them. So again, AVX is just advanced vector extensions and is a bunch of extra instruction sets for x86. Custom run, you can choose which CPU instruction set to use up to AVX512, and the selected set will be used for all Boid systems provided it's supported by the processor. I like when they add in little extra options like that. Again, we've got some more information about how the score is calculated, similar stuff to what we've seen with others. And here we go to the really interesting bit, the Time Spy engine. So the Time Spy Extreme engine obviously uses the same engine as the Time Spy engine. So we can go right to there, which is why we're only going to be running Time Spy Extreme, because they use the same engine. It's just Time Spy Extreme has everything cranked up a few notches. So it's a fully built from the ground up engine designed to take advantage of the full improvement of performance that DirectX 12 offers. So it uses multi-threading, but obviously not beyond 10 threads. It has multi-GPU support, which again kind of shows how old it is as well, because Crossfire and SLI aren't really a thing anymore. It doesn't support different adapters, so it doesn't use the new DirectX 12 stuff they implemented, which I don't think has ever properly been used by graphics card vendors, where you can actually mix two completely different graphics cards together and have them work in a combined fashion. I don't think that's ever really been utilized. The visibility solution, the Umbra occlusion library, is used to accelerate and optimize object visibility and evaluation for all cameras, including the main camera, and light views used for shadow map rendering. Culling runs on the CPU and does not consume GPU resources. So you can read some information about it here. It's a 3D technology company founded in Helsinki, now been acquired by Amazon, been used in major video games from Arkham Knight all the way to Doom. Got a number of products. Umbra Occlusion Booster is GPU accelerated occlusion culling middleware. First released in 2009, and then there's Umbra 3 as well, which has several important features such as streaming, which enables streaming open worlds, shadow and light culling, as well as hierarchical occluder data, which helps open world performance. And then there's DPVS, which is an advanced computer graphics visibility optimization tool, which is again used for large and dynamic 3D worlds. We've got descriptor heaps. One descriptor heap is created for a descriptor type when the scene is loaded. Hardware tier 1 is sufficient to contain all the required descriptors in the heaps. So a descriptor heap is a way to provide metadata required for rendering textures in DirectX 12. So yeah, it's just a way of storing metadata, essentially, for a rendering pipeline. Resource heap. Implicit resource heaps created by the DirectX 12 device are used for most resources. Explicitly created heaps are used for some target resources to reduce memory consumption by placing resources that are not needed at the same time on top of each other. So there's optimizations with memory usage as well. Asynchronous compute, again, I believe which was used in Firestrike as well, used to heavily overlap multiple rendering passes for maximum utilization of the GPU, and async compute workload per frame varies between 10 to 20%. Coarse tessellation is back, Phong tessellation, displacement map based detailed tessellation, very similar to what we've seen in Firestrike. Similar thing where it's turned off entirely by disabling hull and domain shaders when the size of an object's bounding box on the render target drops below a given threshold, and if an object has several geometry LODs, tessellation is used on the most detailed LOD. So if you look here, you can see a different level of detail for this rabbit object here. And the further it gets away from the screen, you use a lower level of detail model with fewer triangles to save on rendering, because the further away from the screen, the less details on it. So whenever a object is a certain distance from the screen, it'll be using, say, this LOD, and then that LOD will be being tessellated. And then once it gets further enough away from the screen, all the mesh and hull shaders get switched off, and it just goes back to presumably the base LOD rather than using any tessellation at all, because it would just get to a certain point where an object is too small on the screen for you to notice how many polygons are really in it. Geometry rendering. Objects are rendered in 2 steps. All opaque objects are drawn into the G buffer. The second step, transparent objects are rendered to an A buffer, which is then resolved on top of surface illumination later on. Geometry rendering uses a LOD system to reduce the number of vertices and triangles for objects that far away. It also results in a bigger on-screen triangle size. And the material system uses physically based materials. So yeah, we're moving into much more modern rendering here. Opaque objects are rendered directly to the G buffer. The G buffer is composed of textures such as depth, normal, albedo, material attributes, and luminance. The material might not use all target textures. For example, a luminance texture is only written into when drawing geometries with luminous materials. Transparent geometries uses a variant of order-independent transparency technique called adaptive transparency. And it looks like there's a full paper on that here. Won't go into too much detail on that. It looks very complex, so I'll drop a link to that in the description. So, simply put, a per pixel list of fragments is created for which a visibility function, accumulated transparency, is approximated. The fragments are blended according to the visibility function and illuminated in a lighting pass to allow them to be rendered in any order. The A buffer is drawn after the G buffer to take advantage of the early depth tests. So essentially, yeah, as mentioned earlier, it's part of the A buffer, which is just a much more efficient way to render things transparency and make sure that they can be done in any order and then finally outputted in the correct order on top of all the geometry. So lighting is evaluated in a tiled method using multiple render passes. So async compute shaders are used to cull lights, evaluate illumination from pre-baked environment reflections, compute screen space ambient occlusion, and calculate unshadowed surface illumination. And that's done right after G buffer rendering is finished and alongside shadow rendering. So all the lights are written to a 16 by 16 tile buffer, and reflection illumination is evaluated for the opaque surfaces by sampling the pre-computed reflection cubes. The results are written out to a separate texture. Ambient occlusion and unshadowed illumination results are written out to their respective targets. Again, that uses some of the A buffer as well. It's just splitting different parts of the render system out into more efficient chunks and then putting them all together. I'm guessing as well is probably an evolution of deferred rendering, and shadows are sampled in both surface and volume illumination shaders. Particles are simulated on the GPU using asynchronous compute queue. Simulation work is submitted to an asynchronous queue, while the G-buffer and shadow map rendering commands are submitted to the main command queue, so that can be done alongside the G-buffer and the shadow map rendering. Particle illumination is rendered by inserting particle fragments into the A-buffer. The engine utilizes a separate half-resolution A-buffer for low-frequency particles to allow more of them to be visible at once, and then they are blended together into the main A-buffer in a combination step. Particles can be illuminated with scene lights, or they can be self-illuminated. The output buffers of the GPU light culling pass and global illumination probes are used as inputs for illuminated particles. The illuminated particles are drawn without tessellation and are illuminated in the pixel shader. So again, it's nice to see self-illuminating particles. Makes for a really detailed particle set. Particles can even cast shadows, and they're rendered into a transparent transmittance 3D textures for lights that have particle shadows enabled before being used as an input to illuminate shaders. An accumulated version of the transmitter's texture is created. So yeah, all the shadows are written to 3D textures. The accumulated transmitter's texture is sampled when rendering surface, particle, and volume illumination by taking one sample with bilinear filtering per pixel or per ray marching step. Resolution of the transmitter's texture for each spotlight is evaluated on each frame based on the screen coverage of the light. For directional light, fixed resolution textures are used. So again, it's just trying to be as efficient as possible and splitting that particle rendering up into as many efficient stages as possible, which I imagine all this is probably a lot more possible. I think this is a lot more advanced than what was seen in Firestrike, and even though this uses feature level 11 and Firestrike was DirectX 11, because this is using DirectX 12 level 11, you can use more advanced techniques. It's just crazy to imagine the amount of work that's going on within a frame. You know, we're talking about milliseconds here, and all this is being processed in that time. It's pretty crazy to imagine the amount that's going on in the hardware. And then we have post-processing, we have depth of field. So we have a circle of confusion radius compute for all screen pixels based on a depth texture, and then it splats a primitive out for out of focus pixels whose circle of confusion radius exceeds a predefined threshold. And then the buffer with splatting primitives for out of focus pixels uses a point primitive vertex data using geometry shader. An image of a bouquet is splatted to the positions of these primitives. So yeah, it's similar to the previous bouquet depth of field they were using on the previous test, using geometry shaders to make the bouquet shape in the background. Again, split up into 4 different segments to process the bouquet. And again, Bloom is the same compute shader FFT that we've seen in previous ones, and supports again blur, streaks, anamorphic flare, and lenticular halo. So that's pretty much the same type of bloom that's being used in Firestrike. And then we have lens reflections, which is similarly done to the bloom effect with FFTs. So yeah, I think the post-processing stuff is essentially the same as what we saw in Firestrike, but probably made a little bit more efficient by the fact it's using DirectX 12 overall. And again, we have a version history here from 1.0 to 1.2, just a couple of little extras. 1.1 added Time Spy Extreme, and 1.2 added the GPU and monitor selector. So it's time to run the actual benchmark itself. So again, we're going to go to a custom run. We're going to enable all 3 graphics tests. We're going to knock it up to 4K. We're going to put the anisotropic filtering up to max, tessellation factor to max, tessellation factor scale up to max. So essentially knocking out everything beyond what it would run on the standard test. It would run at 4K on the standard test, that's the same, but everything else maxed out. You can also disable async compute, so I may run another run of that without async compute to see what the difference is in the results. But let's dive in. So here we are on graphics test 1. So of course this has no sound to it like the demos, but we will rewatch the demos again later. So this is the test that focuses more on transparent elements. This is a lot of the A buffer being used. So you can see clearly all the glass reflections, stuff like that. Man, that looks great. And this has got the really cool Of course, it's called Time Spy, so it's got the really cool magnifying time machine glass thing this character's got, where they can look through it and they can see into the past or into the future, which is really cool. And you can see they're looking through elements of previous 3DMark's here, so a bit of Shattered Horizon. Again, kind of into the whole thing of the shared 3DMark universe. So here we go on to the second test, which focuses more on ray-marched volume illumination with lots and lots of shadowed lights, and a little bit less focus on transparency. So there's still transparency there, but it's not so much of a focus. As you can see, the glass is a lot more clearer, so it's easier to process. So it's much more focused on the particles and the volumetric effects. Oh, look at that. Look at that lens flare. You can see all the particles in the air there as well. Really, really nice looking. Still looks great. And again, there's a Shattered Horizon spaceship. Buggy from Ice Storm, I believe. The horse from the sprite rendering with an alien next to it. What are the aliens from? Are they from a 3DMark? I can't remember what 3DMark they're from. Oh, there's the 3DMark Vantage scene. And there's the skydiver that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. There's the moon that's blown up from Shattered Horizon. Oh, that is so cool. And now we're on to the CPU test, which was designed for CPUs of the time in 2016. So most likely 4 cores at the time. So I think this is what the CPU profile is built off of. But the CPU profile advances off of this. Right up to 16 threads. So it's still pretty stressful on the CPU. As you can see, it's not exactly running ultra fast. And you can see the resolution is low and all the graphical settings are as low as possible to make sure the CPU is doing as much as possible. Man, those particle effects look great. The amount of calculations that must be going on here. I think it's even running in 16-bit. Is that 16-bit? It looks like it. Because that circle in the middle looked really dithered. Probably not running in 16-bit. Probably wouldn't make much sense to try and put modern hardware into 16-bit mode. But here we go with the results. So the graphics score is 12,483. The CPU score's blank. I'm guessing... I'm not sure. Maybe the CPU's too new to give a CPU score with that. So note that down. That was with async on. Relatively good frame rate. Yeah, there was no frame rate recorded. Oh, it's the total time, isn't it, for the CPU test? But it should still give a score based on the amount of time it took to do the whole simulation. GPU load is pretty much 100%, which makes sense given what we've seen with DirectX 12 before. Yeah, about what we'd expect. Now what I'm going to do is run that again with exactly the same settings, except this time we're going to disable async compute and we're going to see what the different score is. Okay, and the result there is 12,349. So that's just over 100 points dropped from having async on. And there's slight differences in GPU load. Yeah, 99% for the most of the second test. So yeah, it looks like it's not fully using the GPU, obviously without async compute. But the frame rates look fairly similar. Maybe a bit lower, but not too much. I think it's heavily indicative that the GPU load is down at 99% on that second test. So it's 100% on the previous one. So yeah, async compute does make a bit of a difference. I don't know whether brute forcing the new hardware doesn't make too much of a difference with that. It probably does because it's quite an old benchmark now. It's about 8 years old. But yeah, it's still interesting to see how async compute changes that score. It could even be there's async compute is no longer such a necessary thing on modern hardware. Just double checking. Nope, on still Nomad asynchronous compute is being used. So yeah, it's still a more modern thing. Maybe the fact that the Time Spy benchmark is so old, it just doesn't make too much of a difference with async compute on or off. I would try Steel Nomad with async compute on or off, but it doesn't have the option, it's just on by default. So it could even be that flicking that switch does nothing nowadays, and that was just a margin of error difference in the points. I'm not sure, but still interesting to see. So now we move on to Night Raid, which is a DirectX 12 benchmark for laptops, notebooks, tablets, and other mobile computing devices with integrated graphics. So it includes 2 graphics tests and a CPU test, same as the other one. So you've got the requirements here. Again, DirectX 12 feature level 11, and there's now support for Windows 10 on ARM. Let's have a look at the system requirements. Less video memory, but basically the same CPU here. These are very high level abstract requirements, so they don't mean too much. But it will run on 32-bit systems, it seems. Still requires 2 gigs of storage memory. Let's have a look at the graphics tests. Graphics test 1 uses deferred rendering. The main source of illumination is the shadow directional light shining through the windows, and there's a few dynamic frustum lights. Unshadowed omni-lights contribute to illumination as well. The scene contains tiny scattered particle systems, screen space dynamic reflection, ambient occlusion are enabled. Post-processing effects include lens reflections and bloom. Graphics test 2 is forward rendered. Tessellated objects appear in almost all frames. There are a few shadowed frustum lights and a small number of point lights. The scene contains large particle systems with depth complexity. Post-processing adds a depth of field effect. So it looks like this is more lighting and shadowing, and it looks like this is more probably tessellation and geometry. And a frustum light is a light that has the shape of a cone, much like the camera frustum. So now we move on to the CPU test, which again suffers from the same visualization issue as Time Spy, where it can make rendering the bottleneck. So they changed to make the test measure the time taken to complete the simulation work. So again, it has a combination of physics computations and custom simulations. And on Windows 10 devices, half the Boids system in the Night Raid CPU test use advanced CPU instruction sets up to AVX2 if supported, and the remaining use SSSE3, which is again the same as Time Spy. And yeah, again, it's for realistic purposes due to how game engines would run. And on devices on ARM, the CPU test always uses the Neon instruction set. Very similar to Time Spy. And then we go to the engine. It uses multi-threading, multi-GPU, the same Umbra vision solution, same descriptor heaps, resource heaps, asynchronous compute, tessellation, deferred rendering, geometry shading, opaque objects, transparent objects, illumination, forward rendering, which is the geometry is rendered in the same order as the deferred mode. The difference is the outputs do not contain material information, but rather results of the illumination, which is done in the same pixel shader. Particles are simulated using asynchronous compute in the queue, and the simulation is executed with multiple compute shader passes. Alongside shadow map rendering, the following steps are executed per frame for each system. A live count of particle is cleared, new particles are emitted, particles are simulated, particles that are alive are counted, and the count is written into a buffer that is used as an indirect argument buffer in the draw phase. And the particles can be illuminated with scene lights, or they can be self-illuminated. So yeah, this is very, very similar. Post-processing, depth of field, same stuff. Bloom, same stuff. I think it's basically the same engine as the Time Spy engine, but it's been optimized for obviously integrated graphical hardware. So there's not too much of a difference between that and the Time Spy engine, except I believe Time Spy is all done in deferred, and this looks like it's done with deferred and forward rendering on the 2 different tests. Transparent objects, they're rendered using weighted order independent transparency, which is another paper which you can grab here from the Journal of Computer Graphics Techniques. So again, there'll be a lot of detail into that. I shall put a link to this in the description. And there's just a bit of information here about illumination in the deferred renderer. For the main illumination passes, async compute shaders are used to color lights, compute screen space ambient occlusion, and evaluate unshadowed illumination. These tasks are started right after gbuffer rendering is finished and are executed alongside shadow rendering. All omni lights are culled, written to a buffer. Frustum lights and environment cubes are culled for every pixel because there are only a couple of them. Ambient occlusion and unshadowed illumination results are written out to their respective textures. And then illumination for shadowed lights is calculated after the completion of the shadow map rendering. The results are combined in the global illumination pass while adding probe-based GI for objects that do not use light maps, and then reflection illumination is evaluated for opaque surfaces by combining screen space reflections and sampling the pre-computed reflection cubes, and then blended into a SSR combination pass. And then the final illumination is then passed into post-processing. So it'll be interesting to see how those 2 graphical tests differ in practice. And then finally, again, we have the version history 1.0 then 1.1. Again, adds in the GPU and monitor selector. So again, we're going to do a custom run. We're going to crank everything up to 4K, which is way above its default resolution. We're going to enable temporal anti-aliasing. We're going to crank up the temporal anti-aliasing quality to max. We'll also enable that on the demo as well. Tessellation factor maxed and the scale maxed out as well. And we'll probably run that without async compute as well, just to see how that differs. So let's dive in. So here we are on the deferred rendering one. So you can see there's plenty of shadowing. Not as much shadowing as you'd think. for a deferred renderer. But yeah, there's the light shining in through the windows. Oh yeah, that's where the deferred renderer will definitely be kicking in. Look at that reflection as well, it's really nice. For screen space, that's really nice. Because they're in complete control of the camera, there's not much risk of it going off screen, so. And then it's combined with probes as well, I believe. It still looks quite nice, but you can tell it's getting old. And also the fact that it was made for integrated graphics ages it a lot more as well. So now we're into the forward rendering one, which focuses more on tessellation. So it's using some of the Shattered Horizon style suits here. So this looks like, if this is like a museum, like a temporal museum, then yeah, what we're seeing is the Shattered Horizon and sort of ice storm looking tech fighting the fire demons, which again, it's all evidence that this is all a shared universe somehow. Oh, look at that, that's very cool. Again, much simpler lighting and shadowing, but it's all in the geometry. I imagine that Firestrike demon has quite a bit of tessellation on it, and so do those rocks. Now we're on to the CPU test, which again has the Firestrike demon. I imagine it'll be similar to the Time Spy one. Yeah. But just a lot more lightweight. Looks really nice. Looks really warm. That's very cool. The crystals growing. The rope simulations up there. Particles. And yeah, here we go. We have actually got a CPU score this time. So we got 59,451 on GPU and then 17,940 on CPU. Again, you can see basically maxed out GPU, except for these bits where it's not so maxed out. Maybe there's some more information that had to be passed to the GPU at that time from the CPU, and it kind of dropped down. It's a bit odd though. And generally the frame rate is pretty much always above 100, very rarely even dropping below 200, with a maximum of 440. So obviously this is a 6-year-old test, and it's meant for integrated graphics, and we're running it on pretty hefty desktop hardware. So I've noted those numbers down, and let's rerun it this time without async compute and see what the numbers are. So yeah, about 400 points lost there, but weirdly a higher CPU score, up from 17,940 to 18,194. That's an odd one. It could mean that the higher pressure on the GPU with async off was relieving pressure on the CPU, giving it a bit of a higher score. But it does definitely make a difference then, because that's twice now we've seen the graphics score change. So yeah, interesting. Async compute definitely makes a difference. I imagine with a more modern system, I imagine if Steel Nomad, if you could turn async on or off, I imagine it's too deeply built into the engine now. If you could turn it on or off, you'd see a big difference with that. I also imagine they don't let you switch it on and off on modern benchmarks, because pretty much everyone will use async compute now. I think in the mid-2010s it was still a bit contested whether async compute was being used. I think there was a whole thing about whether AMD was using it in DirectX 12 and Nvidia wasn't, but I think probably by now everyone is using async compute by default as the technology has matured. So that was Night Raid, and now we move on to the CPU Profiler, which introduces a new approach to CPU benchmarking. Instead of producing a single score, the 3DMark CPU profile shows how your CPU's performance changes and scales with the number of cores and threads used. So again, we got the standard Windows 10, modern multi-core processors, high-level target hardware and software. And there's 6 workloads, so it has the first one, which is the max threads test, measures CPU performance using all available threads. Then there's 16 threads, 8 threads, 4 threads, 2 threads, and a single thread. So this one's a lot more designed to operate on many, many threads. So even if you had like a 32-core CPU, you could probably still run this workload on it and it would do it. Unlike the previous CPU test in Time Spy, which I believe only went up to 10 threads. So let's have a look at the system requirements. Basically the same as Time Spy. Nothing really to see there. So yeah, we have the max threads, The practical use case for this score lie in heavy multi-threaded workloads such as 3D rendering, audio and video production, and software development. 8 threads. Modern DirectX 12 games make better use of multi-threaded performance beyond 4 cores. The gaming performance of CPU usually correlates most closely with the 8 thread score. The score also has a high correlation with the 3DMark Time Spy CPU score. Yeah, so it is a very similar test overall. It's just been rebuilt a bit from the ground up to handle more threading and be a bit more future-proof with threading. So 4 threads and 2 threads. Older games developed for DirectX 9 are often bottlenecked by the CPU on modern gaming PCs. That's true, yeah. Because the GPU is just going to be crunching that DirectX 9 pipeline and the CPU is going to be lagging behind on it, yeah. The frame rates of popular esports titles such as Dota 2, League of Legends and Counter-Strike GO usually correlate with the 2 threads or 4 threads score. And then 1 thread is a fundamental measure of the processor's performance. For gamers and real-world use cases, however, the multi-threaded scores are usually a better indicator of practical performance. Now 1 thread I imagine would probably be interesting if you're playing older games, but then if you're playing an older game that's single-threaded and you're using a more multi-threaded CPU, it's probably going to crunch through it fairly easily anyway. So that is just a general sort of technical test to see how your individual cores run. So we've got the test workload here. So each CPU profile test features custom simulations. The main component of the test workload is an implementation of the Boids system to simulate flocking behavior. The Boids use simple, highly optimized simulation, and it's the same thing where it uses half SSSE3 and a half AVX2. So we've heard a lot about this Boids system. Let's see if we can find some more about that. So Boids is an artificial life program created by Craig Reynolds in 1986, which simulates flocking behavior of birds and related group motion. Okay, it's an example of emergent behavior. Complexity of Boids arises from the interaction of individual agents, the Boids in this case, adhering to a simple set of rules. Okay, so they separate, they align, they cohese together. And the framework was used in Half-Life, the flying bird-like creature seen at the end of the game on Zen, named Boid in the game files. Ha, that's cool. So what they're using is this, but probably in a much more complicated way, really upping the amount of Boids being simulated. So that's very, very cool, and I'm quite interested in artificial life stuff myself. Here's where I plug my own artificial life project, Artificial Life 2. There's a link to that in the description, so go check that out. Especially if you're a dev from 3DMark and you want me to help you out with your next CPU test, let me know. Anyway, that's really interesting. So yeah, that's what it's using. I imagine it's also some of the rope simulation we've seen at the end as well factors into it. But for the most part, yeah, it's the Boid system simulating artificial life. Very cool. And again, we've got some information here about how the CPU scores are calculated. And then we got the version history here, which sits at 1.0. So let's dive into the CPU tests. And already just from the banner, you can see how similar it is to the Time Spy one. So, not many options here. Obviously it runs at the lowest resolution possible, so there's no resolution. Choose what graphics card it runs on. And we're going to do max threads, 16 threads, 8, 4, 2, and 1. Let's do this. Here we're on the max threads test. So, yes, running about 15 frames a second, I think. So I think I have 16 threads in total, 8 cores, 16 threads, so that was maxed out. So this one should be exactly the same. And we're on to 8 threads, which should probably run about half as fast. Not running too much slower. As we approach 4 threads, this one should slow down quite a bit though. There we go, much slower. Yeah, it's almost count the frames by eye. Probably about 7 frames a second there. So I think the first one was probably 15 to 20. The second one probably 15 to 20 as well. The third one was probably 10 frames a second. Now we're heading into the single digits of frames. Yeah. Oh man, look at that. Yeah, about 3 frames a second. So it probably is just around about half in the frame rate each time, which makes sense. Which means 1 thread is going to be horrendous. It'd be interesting to see some lower level detail about how all the threads collate their data together, because I'm guessing it's not like a GPU workload where each result isn't dependent on the other. I'm guessing the calculations are dependent on each other, you know, going forward. So the previous result needs to go on to the next result. So it'd be interesting to see how the threads all collate their data together. Although maybe it's just simulating multiple worlds, or the different threads are doing different parts of the Boids here, the different spikes you're seeing. And of course now we're on 1 thread, which is about 2 frames a second. So this will be where the one thread is doing all the work that 16 threads were doing at first. So yeah, pretty much does scale with the amount of threads, which is to be expected. Although I imagine there is probably one controller thread, so it might not exactly be, you know, double your threads, double your score, double your FPS sort of thing. But we should see, hopefully, some detailed results at the end. I think those little particles, those yellow things floating around, I think they're the Boids rather than the spiky things. Okay, so, yep, max threads and 16 threads are exactly the same because, yeah, I have 16 thread CPU. 8 threads drops to 7,000. So, yeah, it's not quite. It's only 1,000 dropped from 16 to 8 threads. I didn't think the difference was too much there. But then, yeah, you're getting towards half the score with 4 threads, and then again half with 2, and then again half with 1. So just as I thought, yeah, 8 and 16 not too different, which is interesting. I'm not sure why that would be. It could be that, I don't know actually. I don't know. That should scale. Maybe once you hit 16, it get diminishing returns. So you can see here the simulation per frame, 40 milliseconds with 16 threads, 47 with 8 threads, 86 with 4. See, it does start doubling as you get to below 8 threads, but not quite doubling with 16 to 8. Because I would expect to see that go up to 80 milliseconds, like you see here, where it goes up to 80 here, almost twice as much as that. CPU utility here, during 16 threads, 90%. And then the next test, and that's loading again, so it saves result. Okay, so it really goes in detail with your CPU usage. It loads, then it shows the max threads, then the CPU result, then the loading again. So yeah, those two tests, exactly the same CPU usage, makes sense. And then yeah, so about 80% here, 88%. I'm not sure why that's not 100%. It should be 100% really. But then maybe this is where the, as they say, the visualization becomes a bit of a bottleneck, perhaps. But it can't be because it's measuring the average simulation time per frame. I don't know why that's not using 100% GPU and why that drops to 50% on 8 threads, but the score doesn't half and the simulation time doesn't double. And then 31%, 4 threads, 20% for 2, and then 1 thread is about 10%. So even the percentage doesn't quite scale right. Could be a cache thing as you go up to 16 threads and there's not enough cache on the CPU to handle all that. And if you were to up that cache, I mean, I am running a 7700X 8-core with 2 threads each. Actually, yeah, okay. So 8 threads will be using 8 physical cores. When you're using 16 threads, that's using a thread per core rather than actual hardware cores. That's probably why. If I was to actually get a 16 core CPU, you would probably see that double. That makes sense. So that was the CPU profiler test. So now what we're going to do is dive into the Time Spy demo that we saw at the beginning, and we're just going to commentate over it. So again, we're going to max absolutely everything out, exactly the same as before. It's really interesting to see how many references they put in after having recently seen all of the old benchmarks. So there's the smaller historical version of Firestrike there. Oh man, it looks great. I'm fairly certain this is a shared universe now. I'm getting more sure of it. There's a bit of the old Procyon. The whole sort of time magnifying glass thing is just genius. There's the flying ship from 2003, 2005 and 2006. There's the 3DMark 2011 one. There's the frozen landscape one from 2006. See, that looks like a evolution of the Firestrike monster. So they must relate in some way. I just wish there was some more 3DMark 2000 references. But maybe there are and I'm just missing them. There's some Shattered Horizon. See, this is the really cool part. Oh, that's so awesome. They should try and make a game out of this sort of thing, where you have like a time glass like this. That would be an awesome game. Kind of like Portal, but more four-dimensional. Here we go. So check this bit out. It's so cool. It's so cool. And you see, they're reaching for that gun into the past. And I think that's why it's not there in the present, because they reached to get it. It's so cool. You know, like the gun was there in the past, and then out of nowhere, a hand came out from a circle and pulled the gun into the future and disappeared, and that's why the gun isn't there on the stand in the future. It's so cool. I love that kind of thing. It reminds me of that Portal mod. I can't remember what it's called, where it allows like a third time portal. Awesome stuff. Fantastic idea. Anyway, so despite the fact I set it to 4K, it ran at Quad HD. Don't know why. I thought it looked a bit lower resolution than 4K. I don't know why it did that. Never mind. The GPU load there, CPU load, healthy mix between the two. It is indeed a demo, so it's doing both at once. Yeah, set the resolution to that. Maybe it's the internal resolution. Odd. The other ones I'm sure have actually run at 4K when I've selected them to run at 4K, but this one apparently not. Let's now check out the Night Raid demo. Again, let's see if this will run at 4K. Everything up at high. Let's jump in. So again, this should be a healthy mix of the CPU and the GPU. Set with the same engine and in the same similar place as Time Spy. A really cool robot here, which looks like it's set in between the era of Shattered Horizon and Ice Storm. See, this could even be the planet that you see get absolutely fried in the 3DMark Vantage space demo. Because it looks like a planet that has an entire city around it, or at least a very large city on it. So yeah, this could be that planet, and this could be just before it gets blown up by the massive capital ship in 3DMark Vantage. I'm guessing the demo is using the deferred renderer here. It still looks pretty good, even for being over half a decade old and meant for integrated graphics. Still looks fantastic. And I believe it will run on Android as well. Very cool mech there as well. Oh no, it won't run on Android. I thought it would, but it doesn't. It's wildlife on Android. See, the screen space reflections aren't quite as clean there. Still looks damn good. And again, we have the results here. Pretty much what you'd expect. Not much CPU usage, plenty of GPU, because it's obviously meant for lower level hardware. Pretty much crunches through it nicely. And yes, if you look at the 3DMark Vantage test here, the space one, you can see there's a planet here which looks like there's a huge city on it. That could be the planet from Time Spy. I really do want the 3DMark shared universe to be a thing. But anyway, so that was Time Spy Extreme, Night Raid, and the CPU profile. I think next week we'll probably look at wildlife, as well as probably a couple of these feature tests, depending on when they were released. And then eventually we'll make it all the way to Port Royale and Speedway, Ray Tracing Benchmark, and the DirectX 12 Ultimate Benchmark. Now, there's a DLSS test, there's an FSR test, and there's an XESS test. Now, very recently, they released DirectSR, Direct Super Resolution, which is moving, I believe, all of the FSR, XESS, and DLSS stuff all the way up to the API level with DirectSR. So yeah, the number of SR variants continues to grow. Developers are in search of the common SR API that will seamlessly scale across the hardware ecosystem. They are thrilled to announce the preview release of DirectSR, the new API designed to standardize SR support in Direct 3D12 titles. So they've been collaborating with AMD, Intel, and NVIDIA, and that means that games will now just be able to support DirectSR rather than having to support DLSS, FSR, or XESS. So yeah, it removes the need to integrate vendor-specific SDKs or package vendor-specific libraries with your title. Integrating multi-vendor SR has never been easier. I do wonder what's going to happen with the DLSS DLLs. They may not be required anymore. It may just be versioned and built into DirectX, which may be packaged with the game. I don't know, it may still require the DLL. I just kind of hope they still allow you to switch out the DLLs of DLSS, so you can switch between them and upgrade them to get better versions of DLSS. Either way, it's a good thing because it's just like ray tracing. You want to get it behind an API and not too vendor specific, which is of course the entire point of stuff like Direct3D and Vulkan, so that you don't end up in the late 90s again where you have to have different versions of drivers and software and proprietary SDKs built into games to utilize different bits of hardware. The reason why I mention that is because I imagine one day there will be a combined DirectSR test that will be introduced with 3DMark. So I'll look out for that. That'll be really, really cool. Anyway, we are getting our way through 3DMark. One day we will make it back to 3DMark 99 and close the circle on this series. It's been a lot of fun. So if you want to join in and you want more videos on graphics and benchmarks like 3DMark, as well as tech videos, as well as general video game playthroughs, then subscribe, like, drop a comment, let me know what you think, and check out the back history of my videos. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope everyone's staying safe, and I will see you in the next video.